Psychology. Psychology's in, frankly, a bit of a mess at the moment. And my thing is not working. Okay. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so what am I going to do in this talk? I'm going to talk about the two crises that are facing psychology at the moment. I'm then going to talk a bit about some of the responses to those crises. And then the majority of the talk will focus on how we can use some recent global linguistic and cultural databases to go beyond a sort of token response to the challenges of linguistic and cultural diversity. And in particular, I'll look at how they can be used to test claims about universality versus contingency, when it comes to claims about language universals, when it comes to claims about emotional universals. And if there's time, I will at the end finish talk about how they can be used to test Jared Diamond's claims about what turned the fortunes of human history. So, what is the crisis in psychology? What is the existential problems? Well, there are at least two. Probably most of you are familiar with the replication crisis. There was this very influential paper published in 2015 which showed when they attempted to replicate lots of famous studies in psychology, only about 40% of the replicants were statistically significant. So here you can see a graph where they've got the effect size from the original study and the effect size in the replication. And you can see in the green dots, only about 40% of the studies were able to replicate the initial effect. And the effect sizes typically were about only half of the initial study. So that's the first crisis. I think that's fairly well known. Also fairly well known is the so-called WEIRD crisis. This was the acronym that Joe Henrich came up with. And I think the problems were well known to cross-cultural psychologists way before this study, but Joe Henrich and colleagues came up with a sort of useful acronym. And in a paper in Nature in 2010, they did a survey of top psychological journals and found that 96% of the subjects were just from 12% of the world's population. And you might say, well, why does that matter? Psychology in one place is pretty much the same as psychology in the other. Well, you wouldn't say that, but lots of psychologists might think that. But there's a wide range of evidence that shows that psychologies vary enormously across the planet. And just to sort of cover a few of the well-known studies, first of all, studies looking at social cognition, in particular altruism. I've never won the lottery. Is anyone here who's won a lottery? But if you did, what would you do? Would you give some of it to your family? Would you give some of it to your friends? Well, one way in which psychologists and economists have studied this behavior is using what is called a dictator game. These are these kind of nifty economic games that people often try and apply across different linguistic and cultural groups. And basically there are two participants, one player who gets given some money and another one, and the first player has a choice. Does he give any of the money to the second player? So if I gave you $10, there was somebody else playing this game, would you give them anything? Well, it turns out that the responses to this dictator game vary enormously. People, typically US college students, give around a bit over 45% of the money. They behave, at least in this game, in a very fair way, whereas people from traditional foraging societies give way less, a bit over 25%. Now, I think most psychologists maybe wouldn't be too surprised that aspects of social behavior and social cognition might vary across cultures. But what about more sort of biologically based things, such as visual perception? Well, you're probably also familiar with the kind of textbook standard first-year psychology example of the Mueller-Lyer illusion. And when I look at that, the lower line looks longer. I mean, a quick show of hands. Who thinks the top line is longer? No one. Who thinks the bottom line is longer? It looks longer? Yes. And of course, as you all know, actually they're of exactly the same length. So our perceptual processes are not working accurately, or at least our perceptual processes. But when we say our, who are we really referring to? So when this study is done across a range of different cultures, what you find is that, again, people from Europe and from the US, they're the atypical ones. Lots of the people in the room are atypical. People from foraging societies typically see no difference in the so-called Mueller-Lyer illusion task. Okay, so psychologies can differ in terms of social cognition, in terms of visual cognition. Does that matter? Well, yes, it matters, because typically what we study, and this was the acronym that Joe Henrich and his colleagues came up with, is weird people, people from Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic societies. And they are weird. They are the unusual ones when you look globally. And how does that matter? Well, often when we write up papers in psychological journals, we will say, you know, we perceive, or people are biased in their reasoning about certain things. But who are the people? Who is the we? Which people? These things vary. What I want to talk about is some more recent work that shows that those kind of differences go beyond, you know, social cognition and go beyond visual perception. You're probably also all familiar with the so-called London taxi driver effect. This is a study done by Maguire and colleagues in the year 2000, and London taxi drivers, used to at least, have to pass an incredibly demanding test called the knowledge that required them to be able to name thousands of places across London and say all the landmarks they would pass navigating routes across London. And on average, it would take them 12 times to pass this test before they could qualify as London taxi drivers. So it's an enormously memory intensive task. And what the researchers found is that the size, in particular the size of their posterior hippocampus here, was significantly bigger than control subjects. So it seemed like learning the knowledge with the huge kind of memory demands rewired their brain. It made the hippocampus, which is related to memory, in particular the posterior hippocampus, larger. And subsequent developmental studies showed that that correlation was not just a correlation, there was a causal relationship. The size of that part of the hippocampus changed developmentally. So we know that certain kinds of things can rewire our brains. What about language? And I'd like people here to think a bit more about language. So if I part of a mission today, you're all, I think, very familiar with cross-cultural differences, maybe a little less with cross-linguistic differences. But there are around 7,000 languages spoken in the world today. And they differ enormously. Some have just 10 contrastive sounds, whereas some have over 100. Some have really complex words. I'm struggling to learn German at the moment. And some have very simple words. Some have sentences with verbs at the beginning, some with verbs in the middle, and some at the end. So there's enormous linguistic diversity. Could that change our brain structure? Well, some recent work by colleagues of mine at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Science in Leipzig have done a series of fascinating studies showing that, yes, the language you speak can rewire your brain. And in particular, they published this recent paper in 2003 in Neuroimage, where what they did was a diffuse attention imaging study looking at the wiring of the brain. And they compared German speakers with Arabic speakers who are recent migrants into Germany. And they controlled their subjects for a range of different things, including age. And what they found is that the German speakers had more connectivity in the left frontal parietal temporal language network than the Arabic speakers. And they thought that that was due to the demands of processing complex syntax, whereas the Arabic speakers had more connections across the hemispheres. And that they thought was due to the demands, the complex semantic processing that happens with Arabic languages. So culture goes way beyond being kind of skin deep or dealing with behavior. It can shape our visual perception, and it can literally rewire our brains. So what has been the response of like most psychologists to these two challenges? Well, I think there's been a lot of powerful responses to the first crisis, the replication crisis. Increasingly, people are publishing in open access journals where the data is fully accessible and where all the scripts and protocols are accessible and hopefully archived in an enduring place so they can be found, so studies can be replicated, people can reproduce their results. So I think there is a good response going on to the first crisis. But I'm ashamed to say, and I think most of the people in the room are probably an exception to this, the response to the diversity of cultures and how this might matter has been rather different for most psychologists. I would sum it up as this. Most psychologists just don't want to have to bother with having to get subjects beyond, typically first-year psychologists or something like that. And if they do, they think, well, maybe I might get published in a good journal if I included some people who look really different. Maybe I'll disappear off to some far part of the world where there are brown-skinned people, because it's honestly deeply that cynical, and I'll do like just a comparison between undergraduates in the US or undergraduates in Oxford and some folk from Vanuatu. Now, I go to Vanuatu a lot to do research there, and lots of people in my department do. We go there not for those reasons, I hope, but because there are more languages per capita spoken in Vanuatu than anywhere else in the world. So if you want to understand what drives linguistic diversity, Vanuatu is an ideal place to go to. For a population of around 300,000, they have at least 143 languages. On the one island we mainly go to, Malakula, it's an island of 100 kilometers by 20 kilometers. There are at least 43 languages, really distinct languages spoken on that one island. So Vanuatu is super interesting in terms of language diversity. But what I've seen when some psychologists come is perhaps captured by this Gary Larson cartoon about here come the anthropologists. And then you can see in this Larson cartoon, there are the anthropologists wearing their pith hats. And here are the locals quickly rushing away, hiding their TVs and their computers. Now, here's a photo of Quentin Atkinson and I a while ago in a village, Aikanala in Tana. It's a village where quite a few psychologists have gone. And here is the chief Yapa. And you can imagine, and I've seen psychologists from the US, psychologists from Oxford come to this village, and it looks great. They take a few photos, they run some quick economic game, and then disappear again. Now, literally, when this photo was taken, what had happened is we'd turned up, and there they were wearing their t-shirts and jeans. But then along come, the psychologists and the anthropologists. They literally ran off, put on their custom attire, put on their peanut sheaths, and did the traditional dance. So it's a production. It's and Survivor Vanuatu was filmed kind of nearby here. So the idea that these people are somehow remote and disconnected is a total fiction. The chief Yapa, who you can see here, you might think, well, he can't be that globally connected. Actually, he's part of a religious cult that worships Prince Philip. He's actually been to the US, to the UK, and met Prince Philip. He's met his God, and he still believes that Prince Philip is a god. And what he said to me is that I should be fully participating in all the customs and the food in his village, because when he was in England, he had to eat the disgusting food there. And he did, because that's what Prince Philip was doing. So there's a lot of tokenism and exoticization, sadly, that's going on with some, I think, sort of token efforts to really engage with linguistic and cultural diversity. So how might we do better? Well, how might we really engage with kind of global diversity? Well, a major focus of my department at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology is building global databases of linguistic, cultural, genetic, and environmental diversity. I think we have something over 55 different databases that are linked in various ways. And I'm going to talk a bit about a few of these today. And in particular, I'm going to focus on a recently released GramBank database, a database of grammatical variation for over 2,400 languages. LexiBank, a database of lexical variation. I'm going to talk a bit about dplace, a database of cross-cultural variation, and clicks, which I can't quite see here, up here, which is a database of colexifications. And you'll find out why they're important in a minute. But the idea is, let's not cherry pick in a token way cultures. Let's fully engage with the diversity of languages and cultures across the world. Okay, so what can we do with these databases? I want to talk firstly about how we can use them to try and test claims about language universals, how we can test, and Bill talked a bit about this in his presidential address, the sort of tension between claims about universality versus claims about cultural contingency. So, how do languages vary? Well, one of the ways in which they vary is in terms of word order. And there are claims about universality, universals in word order, in particular the sort of Greenberg universals. And sometimes people relate these to efficiencies in kind of processing and in acquisition and in communication. So a standard one is, and I think this is Greenberg's universal number 3, languages of the dominant order where the verb is before the subject, which is before the object, always have prepositions. So if we have a sentence, put is the verb, man is the subject, dog is the object, the preposition in will be before the noun. In contrast, languages that are SVO, where the verb is final, have postpositions. So man, dog, put, canoe, in. Those are two putative linguistic universals. Now, linguists are not one tribe, are not one clan. There's a highly kind of polarized debates that happen amongst linguists, and in particular, the extent to which the human mind imposes strong constraints on language diversity. In the view of Chomsky, the human mind imposes, the innate structure of the human mind imposes very strong constraints on language diversity. And so when he looked at these putative Greenberg universals, what he said was these universals are probably descriptive generalizations that should be derived from principles of universal grammar. And then that was subsequently updated to a sort of principles and parameters account, and then with minimalism into operations, rather abstract ones such as merge. The basic idea is the innate structure of the human mind strongly constrains linguistic diversity. Famously, Chomsky has said that if some ethnobiologists came from another planet and looked at the diversity of the world's languages, they would be struck by how incredibly similar they are. Now, the second person in this picture, Joseph Greenberg, I've mentioned, had a rather different view. He thought there were some regularity, statistical generalizations, but nothing as strong as the kind of tightly linked kind of structures that Joseph Greenberg had claimed. And the third person here, Stephen Levinson, is even more skeptical. He argues that basically there are no real linguistic universals and probably not even these kind of statistical generalizations that Joseph Greenberg had. He had a paper in Behavioral and Brain Science saying there are no linguistic universals. So culture, in his view, trumps cognition. So, is it true? Like you've got these strong kind of a priori views. What does the actual evidence from the diversity of the world's languages show? Well, here you can see a map of the world with data from the World Atlas of Language Structures, and you've got circles, and the outer circle shows the cases where the object is before the verb. And so if the universal is true, they should have postpositions. And the red circles show where the verb is before the object, and they should have prepositions. So if that generalization is true, you should just see blue and red circles. And overwhelmingly, that looks like the case. There shouldn't be many mixed ones. And if you look carefully, you might see a few mixed ones, like one here, but overwhelmingly, that pattern looks like it's confirmed. Convinced? Can anyone sort of think what might be wrong with that comparison of all these different languages? Well, way back in 1888, on the 13th of November, this chap popped up his head. There was a presentation going on at the Anthropological Society of Great Britain, and Edward Tyler was talking about cross-cultural comparisons, about a comparison of post-marital residence patterns and incest avoidance, and showing there was some association between those two variables. But up popped the president of the society. Normally there's one annoying person, often sitting at the back of the room, who asks the real killer question. Well, that's what Sir Francis Galton did. And what he argued was that, look, might it not be that some of the tribes had derived them from a common source, so that they were duplicate copies of the same original? In other words, these languages are not statistically independent. They might be genealogically connected. And this has famously become known as Galton's problem, that we need to factor in the non-independence of languages and cultures. And just to kind of show this visually, if the history of the world's languages look like this, then you could regard them as all statistically independent. But the history of the world's languages looks much more like this, where there are these dependencies, so you can't sample from the tips and assume that each sample is independent. Genealogy, history really matters. All right, so how can we tackle this? Well, one of the ways that my colleagues and I have been tackling this is to use ideas in computational methods for evolutionary biology, where they're used to the fact that, species are not independent. They're related through genealogy. And we can test claims using these methods. So if we're looking at two features that you can see here and marked in circles and squares, and there's red and blue states, if these two features are not correlated, the distribution might look like this. But if they're strongly coupled together, their distribution would look like this, where a change in one feature is correlated in the timing and the genealogy with another feature. And what we can formally use are what are known as Bayesian phylogenetic methods to test between models whether they have this structure or this structure. We can test the strength of the genealogical coupling between two variables. So, in other words, we can test between a model where they're independent versus a model where they're dependent. And I think most interestingly, we can estimate these transition rates. We can estimate the sort of diachronic sequences of these transitions. So, armed with these ideas from evolutionary biology, way back, I think in 2010, Michael Dunn, Simon Greenhill, Stephen Levinson and I set out to try and test these putative word order universals. And we looked at 4 major language families spread across the world: Austronesian, Bantu, Indo-European, and Uto-Aztecan. And briefly, what you can see here is all the features of word order that Joseph Greenberg claimed were strongly linked, and in blue, a smaller set that Matthew Dreyer had claimed was strongly linked. So what I'm going to show you is the sort of Bayesian posterior estimates of the links, the diachronic links between those features. And if Greenberg is correct, then all these things should have strong links between them. If Dreyer is correct, then all these ones should have strong links between them. Here's what we found. What we found was, yes, there are some strong links, but those links vary strikingly across different language families. The links that are strongest, say, in Austronesian and Indo-European are not there in Bantu and not there in Uto-Aztecan. So language family differences, cultural differences, linguistic differences really seem to matter when it comes to these claims about linguistic universals. And even when there was the same dependency, when we looked at, say, the transitions, say, when you have sort of non-harmonic postpositions verb-object, in Austronesian languages, it has a strong tendency to move towards having prepositions, where in Indo-European languages, it moves to having postpositions. So even when there's the same dependency, the historical pathways can be different. So Stephen Levinson loved this result and wrote the conclusion to the paper where he said, basically that culture trumps cognition. just stopped. Oh yeah, here we go. But lots of linguists got very, very, very upset with us for doing this. And I think sometimes for, not good reasons, but sometimes for good reasons. This was only 4 language families, not around 400 language families in the world. Admittedly, though, it was the big one, so therefore it covered a lot of the world's languages, but it is only 4 language families. And the method really only works when you have big language families. And yes, we controlled for genealogical dependencies, but linguistic and cultural features can diffuse geographically. So there can be geographic non-independence as well. So what have we been doing more recently? What we've been doing is to, rather than just select a few putative language universals, to look at a database of over 2,000 universals that linguists have postulated. We've focused in on 191 of those that can be tested with the data that we've built in this GramBank database. And so I'm going to talk now about testing not just a small set of language universals, but 191. And when we looked at these 191, one of the things that stood out was, although they're strongly claimed in the literature, a lot of them arise from really small studies. This is the sample sizes that underlie, sample size being the number of languages covered. And you can see that most of the languages are less than 100. So it's not really a good sample from the diversity of the world's languages. And can you guess where most of the languages that have been studied and used in these analyses that claim universals have come from? James is nodding. They typically come from 1 or 2 kind of language families and are strongly biased to Europe and Eurasia. Certainly not a lot from South America, Southeast Asia, or the Pacific. So, what have we been doing? Well, we assembled a kind of global team of young linguists all across the planet. And the initial paper we published on the GramBank database in Science Advances last year had 105 authors, which I think mirrors kind of Bill's point about, like, if you really want to engage with diversity, having large-scale collaborations is really an important way of doing that. So we have all these young linguists around the world who are coding up 195 grammatical features. And often people worry when you employ this kind of model about data quality. There are problems with sort of big data approaches in terms of data quality. What we did to try and maximize the quality of the data was each feature had a patron, an expert who was in charge of it. And they would communicate via GitHub with the individual coders located all around the world. And people often also worry in big data approaches that somehow complex things get reduced to like a 0 or a 1 in some database. What we've done in this case is, yes, we have our 0s and 1s, but for each data point, there's a rich history of the dialogue that went on with examples and sort of counter-examples between the different GramBank coders and the feature patrons. So I think in this way, we get some of the advantages of rich linguistic scholarship along with a sort of big data approach. So here is the distribution of our sample. If anything, we were slightly biased against having European samples. We're doing a new version where we have a few more, but you can see we've got a very broad coverage, roughly 2,400 languages across the world. And we wanted to control for genealogical non-independence on a global scale. So recently, we've developed a set of global language trees. What we've done is to glue existing language phylogenies together in a Bayesian framework. All right, I'm going to have to go fast. So I did start late. I'm going to go fast. So we use this global tree to control for global non-independence of languages. Well, not a tree, but a set of trees. We, from Glottolog, know the sort of geographic coordinates of the languages, and therefore we can use that geographic information to control for geographic non-independence. And then, for the statisticians amongst you, this is the model we use in the BMRS package in R to run our analyses. And the critical thing is we use phylogenetic and spatial covariance matrices to control for genealogical and geographic non-independence. What do we find? Well, out of the 191 putative linguistic universals, in the initial analysis, we found around 92% of those were confirmed. So strong support for the claim that there are lots of language universals out there. I should say that when I say universal, I mean universal in the sense of statistical dependency, not universal in the sense of no exceptions. But you can probably guess what's coming. What happens when we control for the lack of independence? When we do that, less than half of those universals are strongly statistically supported. So what this suggests is that language is nowhere as strongly constrained as is often claimed by linguists, particularly linguists of a generative approach. Yes, there are some statistical dependencies, but nowhere near as many as is often claimed when you do sort of appropriate analyses. So, do I see the glass as half full, or do I see the glass as half empty? I think it's half full, because I think this is still telling us something, that psychology is shaping patterns, albeit in a much weaker way than people have claimed in the past. So there are some regularities across languages and countries. And part of this is a tendency to what is called harmonic states. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip over these figures, and you're just going to have to take it from me that certain kinds of universals get more support than others, and they tend to go to what they're called more harmonic states. Visually, you can see it like this. Here is a summary global language phylogeny with different language families. So for example, here's the Austronesian language family. And what you can see is the sort of harmonic states. The harmonic states are the black one and the red one. And you can see that language evolution has repeatedly moved into those states across different areas in different parts of the world. So, to summarize, what view does this support? Well, I think we can certainly reject the sort of extreme generative account, but also I think we can reject the sort of Levensonian account that culture trumps cognition, because there are a reduced set, but still a set of robustly supported language universals. I want to move on now to the study of emotion. And again, contrasting claims about universality versus cultural contingency. So I guess a lot of you will be very familiar with the claims and the studies by Ekman and Friedman in claiming that there were universal expressions of emotion, of happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, surprise, and fear. So this was claimed to be 6 universal expressions of emotion regardless of culture. Now, there's been lots of dispute and debate about this, and standardly there's a dispute between those that think emotions are kind of biologically based versus those that think they're culturally constructed. What we did was to try and use language as a window into this debate and as a window into cognition. What we did was to use our CLICS database, and CLICS is a database of colexifications. And what does that mean? A colexification is when you use the same term for 2 different concepts. So here you can see that French colexifies forest and wood with bois. So that would be shown on our network. There's a forest, there's wood, and there's a common term for them both. Croatian uses a common term for tree and trunk. You can see that here. And Yaqui uses a common word for trunk and for root, and you can see that there. So this gives us a window into things that people think are a bit semantically close. We can use these colexification patterns to build up networks which show how the minds in these different languages and cultures are perceiving things or conceptualizing things as being rather similar. So here's a colexification network for things related to grief and anxiety and fear, and you can see just a few languages that have the same word for surprised and for fear. What we can do when we build up these networks, and the CLICS database has over 2,000 languages, is to identify communities. You can use this techniques to identify communities. So here you can see a network, a community related to terms for say. And for example, you can see the strong connections between language and tone, which is not surprising in this community network. All right, so we're going to look at these colexifications. What we did was to look at colexifications for 24 emotion terms across 20 different language families. And we published this, and I give particular credit to to Josh here and colleagues in site, I think a few years ago, 2019. And what you can see here is the kind of global network linking, say, strongly linking happiness with desire and want and proud. And you can see across different language families, so if we look at Austronesian and Indo-European, if we look at the networks linking, say, regret, grief and anxiety, they're also strongly linked in Austronesian. So there are some common patterns, but there's also very striking differences in these networks across the world. So that's just giving like an example here, which I don't really have time to go into. Now, the question arose, like, how different is this cultural variation? How much is universal? How much is differing across these different language families? So sometimes reviewers can be really annoying. Actually, lots of the time reviewers can be really annoying. But I think we were really lucky to get a really good reviewer. And so we initially submitted this paper, and they said, well, this is interesting, and you're showing these semantic networks for emotion terms differ widely across the world, but how can we calibrate just how different or how similar that is? They suggested, why don't you compare that with colexification patterns for color terms as a sort of comparison? And that was a super useful thing to say, and I think it really, really improved the paper. And so what you can see here, what you can see here in blue is how similar across the world these colexification patterns are for color terms, where 1 would be perfectly similar and 0 would be complete difference. And the basic take-home message is that color terms, there's more universality in color terms than there are for emotional semantic colexification networks. So color terminology is less culturally variable, and color semantics is less culturally variable than emotion terms. And we're interested in what might underlie the universality. So we used, I think, 200 participants on Mechanical Turk, and we got them to rank 24 concepts in terms of these different dimensions: valency, activation, dominance, certainty, approach, avoidance, and sociality. And the take-home message when we did a leave one out analysis was that the main effect sort of driving the common patterns could be explained by valency, whether emotions were positive or negative, and activation, how much sort of active state that they were driving. So, does this support the universality point of view? Yes. There seems to be some general processes underlying emotion. Does it support the cultural diversity point of view? Yes. There's also striking differences in these colexification patterns across the world. All right, I'm going to beg your indulgence a little bit because I know I'm going to be a little bit over the scheduled time and cut a bit into question time, but I hope you want to hear about Jared Diamond, right, and his claims about what shaped the fate of nations. So let's quickly talk about some recent work we've been doing testing Jared Diamond's claim. And the claim in this very famous book, which I guess lots of people in this room have read, Guns, Germs and Steel. It was a Pulitzer Prize winning book. It was made into a National Geographic documentary. And the central question that Jared Diamond tries to respond to in this book is a question that was really put to him by a person in Papua New Guinea, Yali. And the question went something like this: why is it that you white people had developed so much cargo and brought it back to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? Now, Jared Diamond interpreted this to mean, why do Europeans create wealthy, powerful nations, and why do we, the rest of the world, fail? So a pretty blunt kind of question, and a pretty ambitious one that Diamond claimed to answer in this enormously influential book. And in brief, his answer was in 3 parts. Firstly, his answer was in many ways like deeply anti-racist, that rather than being due to differences in genes or differences in cognition, it was due to differences in a set of very contingent facts. Firstly, the susceptibility of, in particular ecologies, of wild plants to be developed, to be domesticated. Secondly, the ability to domesticate large wild animals for food and transportation, horses and cows, and therefore in agricultural production. And the third thing was geography, that the relative lengths of the continents has a major implication for the spread of human populations and technologies, and ultimately the success of nations. So he used a phrase in the book that geography turned the fortunes of human history. What was that based on? Well, it's known as the axis of orientation hypothesis. And what Diamond, as a kind of human geographer, noted was that if you look, say, in Africa or also in the Americas, there's this predominant north-south axis of orientation. And if you have to go from, say, here to here, you have to cross mountain ranges and lots of differences in temperature and ecology. Whereas in Eurasia, if you go from here to here along the steppe, you've got ecologically very similar zones, very similar kind of temperature zones. And his claim was, therefore, this hugely shaped human history because cultural innovations and agricultural innovations and military innovations could spread much easier in Eurasia than they could in other parts of the world. And it was those axes of orientation that turned the fortunes of human history. So that, I think, is a really intriguing idea. There were a range of reactions to it. Let's see them. Diamond had lots of prizes, but was also attacked for scientism, for Eurocentrism, for being a neoliberal apologist, an ecological determinist, and for the claim that he flattened history just to this one dimension, that everything is explained by geography. Well, those things could be true, but as scientists, what we want to find out is not things about Diamond's personal politics or whatever, but really, is his empirical claim correct? And although he gave a series of examples, anecdotes perhaps, there was really no quantitative testing in his book. And this is not really an easy hypothesis to test, because you think about what you would need to test it. You would need to have information about the location of cultures. You would need to have information about the variation in those cultures. You would need to know how easy it was to get between those cultures. And you would need to control for genealogical and geographic non-independence. So that's a lot, but that's what my colleagues and I have been trying to do. So what we did, and in particular this work was done by Angela Shearer and Carlos Botero, is use a range of measures to calculate costs. Costs in terms of changes in sort of temperature between locations, changes in aridity between locations, and least cost kind of hiker's distance kind of pathways. So we have measures of the travel kind of costs or the ecological costs, because we used the dPlace cultural database, which also has fine-grained environmental data for lots of locations around the world. So we could calculate these ecological distances as well. This is dPlace. It's a database that's publicly accessible. It combines data from the Ethnographic Atlas, from Binford's data, from the cross-cultural sample, and actually increasingly a number of other cross-cultural databases. So we get our cross-cultural data and the environmental data, which is in here, to do these analyses. And we combine them with our cost path analyses. So here is in the grey dots the societies we looked at. We didn't include any oceanic ones for sort of obvious reasons. We wanted to control for genealogical non-independence, so we used a global language tree from Gerhard Jaeger, and we wanted to control for geographic non-independence, so we used various measures of geographic distance. What did we find? Well, if Jared Diamond is correct, then there should be two parts that should be supported for his hypothesis. First, cultures that are ecologically, latitudinally closer should be more culturally similar, even when you control for geography and genealogy. So if you look at a range of cultural features, once you factor those out, they should be more similar. So in the graph that I'm going to show you, you should expect their values to be negative. And if they're in blue, that means they're significant. And what you can see here is that overwhelmingly, the first part of his claim, his sort of central intuition, that ecologically similar, latitudinally more proximate cultures are easier to spread innovations to. When we look at a range of cultural features from subsistence to housing to property to kinship and marriage, social organisation, across the board, these things are more similar than you'd expect. So his intuition, as a geographer, as an ecologist, was correct. But does this predict, does this turn the fortunes of history? Does this predict, does this single out Eurasia as the continent that should have the most advantage? So these figures are a bit complex, but basically what you can see here is Eurasia is in this green color, and if it's consistently singled out across these different cost metrics, it should consistently be having lower values on these graphs. And it doesn't. There's no kind of consistent pattern there. So the sort of ecological claim that Jared Diamond made, I think, is correct. But his claim that this singles out Eurasia, this does not receive support. I think this is the first quantitative test of his axis of orientation hypothesis, and we don't find support for that kind of ultimate claim. The axes of orientation turned the fortunes of human history. So if you want to read about more, you can read about it in this paper recently published in the Evolutionary Human Sciences. To sum up, what have I tried to show in this talk? I wanted to show that if we want to go beyond kind of token comparisons and exoticism, there's a lot to be gained from leveraging these global databases of linguistic and cultural variation. And by engaging with them, we can use them to test long-standing hypotheses. Hypotheses about language universals, hypotheses about emotional universals, and hypotheses about factors that might have shaped the fortunes of the nations we live in. Te mira kasi, thank you.